we're kind of pushing the goalpost back on what it really does mean to be an adult and a really significant contributor to your community. And I think that a lot of those same arguments of you could fight for your country or you could die for your country are still applicable when we talk about things like driving and working and paying taxes. And I think that the American system was built on the system of no taxation without representation, and yet 16 and 17-year-olds that work, they can pay taxes and have no congressional representation. And I think that in general, this would help younger people get elected. Somebody like Maxwell Frost is our only really young representative in Congress, and he's not even really that young.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Boston's Old South Meeting House, which together with the Old State House just up the street is part of Revolutionary Spaces. My name is Nat Scheidley, and I'm the president of Rev Spaces, and our mission is to bring people together in these two buildings to explore our nation's continuing struggle to create and sustain a free society. Today, we are gathered for a debate on the legal voting age. Should it be lowered? Should it not? Should it be raised? Should it be eliminated? Why or why not? And how does the legal voting age impact civic engagement for young people, Gen Z or otherwise? So our moderator for today's debate is Alexi Cohan. Alexi is a digital producer for GBH News, specializing in politics, digital video, and special projects. She also reports stories for GBH News' website and radio, and is the lead producer for Politics IRL, a video series centering Gen Z voters. And with that, I turn it over to you. Alexi, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Nat. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here for the debate. I'll introduce our debate participants and explain how the debate will run. First, the participants. Hannah Kelleher is a junior at Suffolk University. She's studying political science, and she's from Kingston, Massachusetts. Patrick Walsh is a junior at Suffolk University. He is studying political science, and he is from Somerville, Massachusetts. Kunal Botla is a Tufts University student and a GBH Politics IRL participant from Lexington, where he is an elected member of the Lexington Town Meeting. He is the only Gen Z member of that body. Trey Fucillo is a GBH Politics IRL participant and a Marlborough City Councilor representing Ward 6. He's a graduate of Emerson College. We're also pleased to announce Representative Annie Custer, who is a former member of the United States Congress, having represented New Hampshire's 2nd Congressional District from 2013 to 2025. We're also excited to welcome Rachel Cobb. She is a political science professor at Suffolk University. Representative Chris Shays was unable to make it, and she is participating in his absence. Round of applause for the participants. So for the debate format today, we will allow each team 90 seconds for an opening statement. This team represents the for or supporting lowering the voting age. This team represents against. After the opening statements, I as moderator will ask a series of 6 questions. Each team will have 1 minute to respond and an additional 30 seconds for rebuttal of the opposing team's response. Participants were assigned a team ahead of the event. Following the round of questions, we will conclude with closing statements up to 90 seconds. And after that, time permitting, we'll have an audience Q&A. Audience can line up at this microphone for the Q&A at the conclusion of the debate. So based on a coin toss that we started today before the event, the supporting team will make the first opening statement, followed by the opposing team. The opposing team will then respond to the first question, and teams will alternate thereafter. At the conclusion of the debate, the supporting team will make the first closing statement, and the opposing team will follow. Let's get started with the opening statements, which will last for up to 90 seconds. We'll start with this team.
Democracy thrives best when it reflects the voices of all those impacted by its decisions. 16 and 17-year-olds today are more informed, engaged, and affected by government policies than ever before. They hold jobs, pay taxes, drive cars, and contribute to their communities. Yet they are denied one of the most fundamental rights of citizenship, that being the right to vote. The idea that they lack the knowledge or maturity to make informed political decisions is not supported by any substantial research. There are studies from countries that have lowered the voting age that show that these young voters are just as capable, if not more engaged, than older first-time voters. More importantly, introducing voting at 16 while students are still in high school and connected to civic education leads to higher participation rates, long-term participation rates, and a stronger culture of lifelong voting. 16-year-olds also often have more stability in their lives than 18-year-olds who may be joining the military, going to school in a different city or state, and working full-time, often in a different city. If we truly believe in representative democracy like we claim that we do, we must ensure that those affected by policies, whether on education, climate change, or the economy, have a say in shaping those policies. Lowering the voting age to 16 isn't just about fairness, but about strengthening our democracy for generations to come.
Opposing team.
Lowering the voting age is not a popular proposition amongst the general public. Lack of interest in politics, lack of knowledge, stability in political beliefs and views, these can all be affected by different aspects that are unstudied. Cognitive capacity, what is the significant developmental problems that could impact this? How do you know that someone is mature enough to vote at 16 compared to 18? How does a parent's influence or peer influence determine someone's political ideology or the way that they vote? How does misinformation or echo chambers or significant use of the internet contribute to this? Motivation or political aptitude, it has been shown that teenagers are not as motivated politically, and how this can be a problem in legal issues with adultification or consequences due to political advertising or even other predatory advertising, or consequences in the criminal justice system or among the foster care system. There is even concerns of negative effects of temporary disenfranchisement and how this might affect voter participation and habitual voting in the future.
Moving along to the first question and staying with this team, you'll have 1 minute to respond. The current legal voting age in the United States is 18 years old. Prior to the passage of the 26th Amendment in 1971, it was 21 years old. Some municipalities across the country have lowered the voting age in local elections to age 16. Should all municipalities follow suit? 1 minute to respond.
Thank you for the question, Alexi. No, not all municipalities should follow that model. And I think the biggest reason why is the fact that people will only be able to vote in municipal elections. And so I think it's very difficult for young people at that age, at 16 and at 17, to have an appreciation for what municipal government is when they're not able to also have that understanding of state and federal government. I think, why should we limit them to just municipal government? To me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so for that reason, I think pre-registration is so important at 16 and 17, getting them pre-registered to vote so they're not just focused on some ambiguous municipal election coming up, but that they're able to focus on the municipal, the state, and the federal elections that they'll get to vote in when they turn 18. It's just like having your permit for a driver's license, right? When you're 16, you get your permit. That doesn't mean you can just go drive your car wherever you want. You have restrictions. And so I think that's what pre-registration is for. So I'd like to see people be pre-registered at 16 and 17. That way they can then be eligible to vote at 18.
Your response for 1 minute.
Change is incremental, and I think that, yes, absolutely all municipalities should be requiring that 16-year-olds vote. It's an opportunity for our high schools to take the moment to teach our young people about what their local government is doing, which of course is what is funding their schools and taking care of their education and has shaped much of their life to that moment. And so their voice at that level is actually so critical for them to be able to make the change that they want to see in the world.
30-second rebuttal to the team's response.
Thank you. I think that's a strong point, but I don't think that voting is the only way that young people can be engaged in this process. Almost every municipality in the country has a youth commission, and they have an incredible amount of power and influence over what city councilors do, over what select boards do, town meeting. So to say that voting is the only way young people can make change in their communities, I think is a little, I think it's shortcoming on young people. There are other ways to be involved in the political process aside from just being able to vote in those elections.
Moving on to question number 2, this team will start. Casting an informed vote requires civics education and access to trustworthy information. In an age of social media misinformation and attacks on public school curriculum, are they prepared to make educated votes? This team begins with 1 minute.
I think the attacks on education and the focus on education about civics and about general like government education is a reason for 16 and 17-year-olds to be able to vote. They have a direct stake in what the school district is teaching them, and if they have a vote in what the school district is teaching them, they are more likely to be connected to that and have an actual implication. And it also incentivizes governments to make sure that teenagers are well educated about how local government works and how government works. There's also the whole kind of perspective of information, but the information that 16 and 17-year-olds have access to because of the internet is largely the same as every other age demographic. If they're looking at online content that's available to them, anyone else could be. The same misinformation risks that apply to them apply to every other age segment in the US or in the world.
Well, I have tremendous regard for 16 and 17-year-olds. I'm very concerned about the influence of nefarious forces on the internet, on social media, and whether or not our 16 and 17-year-olds have the maturity that our 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds have to be able to assess the veracity of the information and the quality of the information and the source of the information. I think it's something we're all coping with in the environment that we're in right now. And when you have one individual that can spend $288 million on an election and micro-target individuals on the internet with information that may or may not be true, this is a very dangerous time to take that step.
30-second rebuttal.
It is absolutely a very dangerous time, and there should be far greater regulation of social media in general. But my colleague is absolutely right. Everyone is accessing this terrible, awful world of misinformation. The fact of the matter is our 16-year-olds are a captured audience because they are in school. And so we have the opportunity to teach them media literacy at 16 and 17 that we don't have at the upper ages.
Moving on to question 3, this team will respond first. Children under 18 are treated as adults in many circumstances. If they work, they pay taxes. They're eligible to drive at age 16 and can even be tried as adults in certain criminal prosecutions. Are these arguments enough of a qualifying factor to lower the voting age? 1 minute.
Okay, what I would say to that is that there is a concern of 16-year-olds becoming adult before that they are ready. At 16's individuals are not granted adult privileges like signing contracts or drinking alcohol or joining the military. I think there's a great concern that advocates for lowering the voting age don't realize that voting entails civil equality in this adult responsibility, and these protections of material support from a family or a state or protection against predatory campaigns, predatory labor laws, all of these protections would be removed if a 16-year-old became an adult. I think these laws are in place to stop these predatory things from happening. There's also concerns with the criminal justice system further targeting 16-year-olds, and even this can have a concern among race and African-American teens who are predominantly targeted in the criminal justice system.
Your response.
I think those are all very fair points, but I do think that when we talk about voting age, we can't ignore 1971, the 26th Amendment, which was fought for because we lowered the voting age, or because the draft age was lowered to 18, and the argument was that if you were 18 to 20, you couldn't vote, but you could serve your country and die for your country. And I think that today, because the draft really isn't on our minds a lot, 16-year-olds are having to adult way more. They're bigger parts of their communities. And I think that we're kind of pushing the goalpost back on what it really does mean to be an adult and a really significant contributor to your community. And I think that a lot of those same arguments of you could fight for your country or you could die for your country are still applicable when we talk about things like driving and working and paying taxes. And I think that the American system was built on the system of no taxation without representation, and yet 16 and 17-year-olds that work, they can pay taxes and have no congressional representation. And I think that in general, this would help younger people get elected. Somebody like Maxwell Frost is our only really young representative in Congress, and he's not even really that young compared
That
to
is
us.
time. 30-second rebuttal.
I wanted to go back to the point about predation and predatory. In New Hampshire, we only recently changed the law. We had marriage under age 16, and you had situations of predatory behavior of a typically male person taking advantage of a female person and controlling them with the support and sanction of
That
the
is time,
law.
Representative. Question 4. We'll start with this team. If a young person can vote for municipal office, why should or shouldn't they be able to vote for governor or for president?
I think the voting age should be lowered to 16 for all offices and not hold it only for municipal elections. There is a pathway to change, and sometimes it is through the municipal elections. But at the end of the day, for all of the reasons that my colleagues have outlined, for the kinds of contributions that our young people are making, and the kind of impact that all of the laws are having on them and their future, whether it is climate change, whether it's taxation, whether it is access to healthcare, whether it is access to food, all of those issues are profoundly impacting every age. And yet the political voice that young people have does not begin until they turn 18. How much more invested would they be? How much more engaged would they be if they could express their political voice at a younger age and feel that their entire political life was being listened to?
I agree with that point, that it's a little bit of an all or nothing, in my personal opinion. Why limit them to just a municipal election? However, with that being said, I again go back to this point that I don't think people's political voice starts at 18. I think that your political voice starts whenever you want it to. Nobody is preventing you from going to a protest and speaking out when you're 16 years old. Nobody's preventing you from going before your local city council or select board to speak at public hearing. I know that that might be a difficult thing to do, but nobody's preventing you from doing that. Again, to the point, I think pre-registration at 16 should be across the board, across the country, and I think we need to educate people when they're 16 during that pre-registration process. I don't think any of us would disagree with that we need to do more voter education to young people. But again, I don't think anybody's being stopped or hindered from being involved in politics before the age of 18.
I think the context that you present is a great example of why it matters to be a voter, right? If you're sitting in front of your city council, your select board, town meeting, and you're talking about what matters to you, we hear time and time again, people mention that they're a voter. Being a voter is a very core part of American democracy. Being a pre-registered voter is more administrative than anything. You know, you've submitted the documentation to say that you could be a voter when you're 18 and you become a voter at that point. But if you're a 16-year-old sitting in front of your select board talking, you're not treated the same way as an 18-year-old or even a 19-year-old who can say that they're a voter.
Moving on to question 5, we'll begin with this team. Politicians serve the constituents who elected them. Would lowering the voting age change anything about their job performance in office?
I think the people in elected office are serving their constituency of whatever age. And so meeting with, whether it's member of Congress or someone on the city council is a really important step. And I think we should encourage our elected officials to include younger people. I also think campaigns are a great way for younger people to get involved and have their voice be heard at any level of government. And my objection really has more to do with whether or not the vast majority of 16 and 17-year-olds are prepared to take on this responsibility without being unduly influenced by whether it's on the internet or whether it's YouTube or Twitter, the information that we know is not accurate right now. And it's very powerf1, but not accurate.
I admit that I am one of the few unelected people on this stage. But one thing that strikes me is that one of the most important things to anybody who is running for office is the voter list, and that they pay strong attention to who is on that list and who is, and really don't pay as much attention to who is not on that list. And so when campaigns are going door to door and engaging with people, they are purposely, for very good reason, essentially ignoring the non-voters, because that's a waste of their time and effort, because they're trying to get as many votes as possible. So I think it is critical for people to be a part of that list and be the ones that politicians are engaging with. That's number one. Number two, absolutely, there are lots of ways to get involved in politics, and pre-registration is a wonderful thing. But at the end of the day, the vote is political voice, the most fundamental political voice that any one citizen has. And so all
That
of
is
these
time.
other forms.
Moving on to this team, 30-second rebuttal. Thank you for the audience participation.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's the obligation of the candidates running for office to be out there in their community, not just talking to voters, but non-voters as well. I'm proud to say that on our campaign, we knocked every door. We didn't care if you were registered or unregistered. We went and knocked on your door because you lived in our community. And if I got into that office, I was going to represent you just the same. So I completely agree. It's an obligation to the candidate, but I don't think that necessarily means we have to lower the voting age. We just need good people running for office.
Moving on to our final question. This team will respond. Most children under 18 still live at home and are subject to the influence of their parents or guardians. Do they have enough independence and life experience to cast an informed vote?
I think we've already answered that question as a society, right? You know, teenagers can drive, they can pay taxes, they can work jobs, albeit with restrictions, but they have those abilities, and they make one of the most important decisions in American kind of professional society of deciding where they go to college. That's frequently talked about as like a life-shaping event, as a mechanism for prosperity or job opportunity. And that decision happens when people are 17 and they decide what those options are at 16. And so they're making really large scale decisions pretty early on in that kind of like teenage segment at like 16 and 17. And I would say that young people are more informed than ever about what issues are important to their community, to them, to society as a whole, and about making rational, kind of thought out decisions about what should happen with each of those issues in terms of a candidate or a ballot measure. And I would argue at like that municipal, state, or federal level, even though the conversations right now are really focused on the kind of like local municipal level change at the moment.
I would say that the concern for like a 16-year-old voter compared to an 18-year-old voter is that you are like living at home with your parents. From a young age, you're exposed to your parents' political beliefs and values, and you're influenced by their perspectives. And I think this could have a large-term effect on people's voting behaviors. And there's discussion of current events, general political climate in the household. It's even been through a Pew Research study that Republican Party, 81% of these teens identify with the Republican Party as their parents have. 86% for Democratic, they relate to the same party as their parents. This is something that has an influence on as they grow, how they learn, and how they interact with the political climate and continue to support certain causes or not. It's because they're raised in this certain environment.
There are countless studies over the last 10 years out of Scotland, Austria, Malta, Norway, Germany that prove that lowering the voting age, whether it's permanent or in a short-term trial, actually completely is independent from parental voting, from school voting, from friend voting, everything. Sometimes in some countries there have been cases of political parties being favored, but there are trends that show that political preferences change over time. You grow more conservative as you age, and if you put more liberal children in the democratic process from an earlier age, they will likely grow more conservative. So the kind of party issue I don't think is very relevant for this topic.
Moving on to closing statements. As this team provided the first opening statement, this team will provide the first closing statement. Each team will have 90 seconds.
I think that this conversation that we've had today has been productive in a lot of ways, because I do think there are areas in which we agree. But I think fundamentally, there is a strong difference between what it means to be engaged in the political process and what it means to vote. I believe anybody can be involved in the political process, especially young people at whatever age. I have seen 16-year-olds come before our city council and make very articulate points. And I understand that people want to give them the vote at 16, but then what's to stop a 14-year-old? What's to stop us from keep going lower? I think there has to be some kind of a threshold, and I feel that in the present state, 18 is that threshold. You can join the military at 18. You're eligible for jury duty at 18. I think that 18 is not an arbitrary number, but a number that's been picked over time because we're seeing that that is the age in which people start to be involved members of their communities in a lot of ways. They're able to make those big life decisions like going to college. I mean, yes, it happens at 17, but again, that's what pre-registration is for, in my opinion. I think being pre-registered, it's just like a driver's permit. That's the metaphor that I'm going to keep using. I don't see how it's any different than that. So I will hand it over to them.
I think throughout this conversation, a big thing has been that voting is a core part of American democracy. I mean, the space we're in right now was kind of like the beginnings of the Boston Tea Party and the beginnings of the American Revolution that was focused on not having the right to vote. And so I think we all understand the value of how important having the direct kind of voice, that direct voice in democracy and in government is for Americans in general, but especially for 16 and 17-year-olds who are, like we started off by saying, informed, have access to the same information that everyone else in the US does. They pay tax, they're involved in government in that way. They drive, they operate motor vehicles, are licensed to do that, and are part of the legal system for that. Other countries have shown that there are examples with increased engagement, increased voter turnout. It starts the habit of voting at a younger age when things are more stable, and they're more likely to continue voting throughout their life. And generally, young people deserve a voice. Young people aren't like a homogenous group of people, and they deserve a voice that really represents their interests and what matters to them in government and in society. We've talked about a lot of different types of things, about a lot of different types of concerns with information, with logistics, or with like influence by other people. But I think it's really important to note that young people have existed as an independent group, have been influential in a lot of things in US history without kind of dependence on their parents or with the systems that surround them. Even in Massachusetts, we've seen a lot of municipalities push for this, and I think a statewide push would even be reasonable.
Give a hand for our debate participants. Excellent job to all of our participants. Wonderful. We'll now move on to a Q&A. If you have a question for any of the debate participants, please line up at this mic and we'll fit in as many questions as we can.
All right, so this question is in response to question 6, and it's more like, it's more directed to the pro team. So I believe one of your members said that, like, 16-year-olds have this independence where, like, they can drive cars, some of us can get jobs, we can choose what colleges we go to, but at the end of the day, I mean, 16-year-olds are still under the sort of, in terms of a money sort of perspective, they're still under their parents. You can choose what college you want to go to, but it's up to your parents to say, okay, we'll provide you with this money to go to college. We'll allow you with this money to get a car. We'll allow you like this money to do whatever you need to do. So my question is, considering that the majority of 16-year-olds are still within this monetary umbrella of their parents, what does the pro team have to say in terms of this?
Alex chime in, but I guess one thought is, at lots of times we are under monetary umbrellas. It's not just at 16. And there are lots of forces that are essentially keep constraining us greatly economically. So that argument only holds so much water for me because at the end of the day, I'm still a person who is experiencing policy and the impact of policy on me. And yet, even though I can participate in lots of ways, I still cannot have the voice that I could at 18. And so there is something sort of arbitrary about choosing 18 as opposed to another number, given all of the things that are happening in my life.
And I think another kind of point related to that is that in like I think the umbrella specifically that you're talking about, where you're under your parents for maybe financial dependency or some kind of dependency, doesn't end at 18 for a lot of people. Because if you're going to college and your parents are paying for it, arguably there's more pressure then than at 16 when they will be potentially paying for something in the future. And I think another beautiful thing that we have is that the ballot box is private. No one knows how you voted. No one can influence your vote in the ballot box. And so there's kind of like, maybe even more so than a public comment, there's less accountability, and people in terms of like having to, justify your vote to someone, compared to a public comment where you're publicly kind of holding that opinion and you have to hold responsibility for that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful debate that you had. My name is Tony. I actually work for the Boston City Council, and I actually wanted to let people know that the City Council actually voted 9-4 back in December 22 to extend voting to 16 and 17-year-olds at the municipal level. That was a home rule petition that was sent to the state. So first is kind of like a call to action to make sure you contact your state legislatures and help the city of Boston do what it wants to do. But my actual question is, do you feel that the state should be compelled to give those powers to the city of Boston, which did approve that measure?
I think personally, I definitely should. I know in 2019 and then in every subsequent session, the Empower Act has been approved, which stands for some long acronym that I do not remember, but effectively it would change, I think it's Chapter 51 of the general rules or the general laws to basically let any city, no matter what, as long as they have city council permission, to lower their voting age to 16 or 17. So I think that when you get things like that, where it's now up to what I think 11 cities and towns that have tried to lower their voting age over the last 25 years, and every single proposal has gone to the State House and not made it out alive, I think there definitely needs to be some reform, even if it's to give more municipalities that autonomy over their own laws.
All right, thank you.
I just want to give Kunal a quick opportunity to respond to this because he also filed a home rule petition in his capacity as elected official.
Yeah, so I actively have a home rule petition going through the process of, select board review, and we'll be in town meeting later this spring. And the select board, even just on Monday, was in favor, had a majority opinion in favor, and was really talking about their focus concern was about how the legislature will act. And I think that's what a lot of us are talking about in terms of opinions. And there's one power that controls this, the legislature, the committees that are involved in this process, the committees on changing voting regulation. So I'd really encourage you to reach out to your representative, especially if they're on one of these committees, because for anything to happen, this has to reach a hearing and then actually become a conversation on the floor of the legislature so that people can, like Trey was talking about, testify and talk to their experience and talk about what's happening. But if that opportunity doesn't exist to talk about this issue, then it's really not a conversation that will go anywhere.
Hi. So there were a lot of points made about having access to civic education in high school and that being a main reason for why 16-year-olds should be allowed to vote. However, it was kind of said as in everyone has access to that. I personally went to a really underfunded, poor high school. I did not have civic education at all. And I know that people otherwhere in the district who went to maybe more wealthy or better funded schools did have that, but if I wanted that, I had to go seek that out myself through extracurriculars or teachers that I knew were trusted, unbiased sources. So I guess I'm just wondering how exactly we would implement this, and I kind of fear that it would just become another luxury that kids who live in wealthier areas or attend really well-funded public schools would only have access to.
I'll just take that on. That's one of my concerns is the equity behind this. And I think one place to put our collective energy would be into teaching civics education at all levels, starting at a younger age, but definitely 16, 17, 18-year-olds, so that when they are voting, they'll have a better sense of, what makes up the city council? What are the laws that are local? What are the laws that are at the state? How many state legislators? How do I communicate with them? And then on up, Congress, the US Senate, the president, how is that chosen? We actually have a very complex process for all of this, and it takes quite a while to understand it. So we could all focus on equal access to civics education.
Hello, I'm Danny. Nice to meet you. My question is just about the analogy between the driver's license and the pre-registration to vote. Because the way I understand it is that when you have a permit, you're not like pre-registered to drive. You're driving and you're on the road with other drivers, even though they have a license. But like, you have like you're taking the same risk as the other people. So yeah, I guess I'm curious just how that analogy is meaningful to you.
No, I appreciate the question. And cat's out of the bag. I was assigned to this side. So, not everything I said I actually believe. But I think, going with that analogy, this is where I'm coming from. When you have your permit, yes, you're allowed to drive, but it's with restrictions. You can't just take the car out on your own and go wherever you want, right? You have to drive with somebody. You have that grace period where there's a certain amount of time that you have to do that. And even after, once you get your license, there's certain restrictions that still stay on that license. So to me, I feel like pre-registration is similar in the sense that you are pre-registered to vote. You will be able to vote the day you turn 18, right? You then, the training wheels are off, you're going. So that's where that analogy comes from, in my opinion. I can understand where you're coming from, right? You get to drive at 16. But I think the fact that when you're pre-registered, it's almost like you're ready to vote, but you're not able to do it quite yet. Just like in the sense that you have a permit, you're ready to drive, but you're not able to just go out on your own and do it quite yet. But I can understand where that does fall short. So good question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lindsay. I'm a student at Suffolk. Thank you guys for being here. Great debate. Unfortunately, you really shattered the illusion for me there, but we're working through it. I'm circling back to the tech piece of it. You guys have brought up concerns, of course, about ages 16 through 18's ability to, or 16 and 17's ability to identify and avoid falling victim to disinformation on the internet. Are we sharing these same concerns with any other age group? Surely 1 year between 17 and 18 cannot equal automatic immunity to misinformation. And are we concerned about Gen X and beyond not also being unequipped to identify and avoid disinformation on the internet?
I think you bring up a really great point, and I'm trying to say this in a way where my fellow members of town meeting won't be offended. I think there's a perpetual defense against truth. A lot of the times, a lot of things that come up in government, that come before government, are very controversial. If we're talking about changing school budgets, that implicates to a lot of people. If we're talking about what to do in terms of police reform, people have strong opinions, and there's a strong opportunity for false information. In my experience, I've noticed that false information is more kind of like believed, not by people who are looking at content on TikTok that's like a Russian, bot, or a foreign government talking about, your government is doing this, this, and this, which can kind of quickly be identified as false information. But something more local where they say your planning board is corrupt. Your planning board is trying to ruin your neighborhood. It's trying to destroy your schools, and it's trying to change the environment of Massachusetts forever. And there's one that resonates there's one that hits one age group, and there's another that hits another age group. And I think information like that, that's like untrue information about your planning board or your select board or your school committee board, is more impactful and more damaging than the information that's very quickly identified online as being misinformation or false information, and can even be labeled by a lot of these platforms as false information, like was done in the 2020 elections.
I'll also just say, I think you're right that I think misinformation is a concern across the board for all ages. I just wanted to kind of share this like study that I found interesting from the Center for Countering Digital Hate. They did find from their survey results that 49% of adults were likely to believe, like they have conspiracy theories that they listed, at least 4 of the conspiracy theories, but the teenagers that they surveyed were like 60% more likely to believe at least 4 of the conspiracy theories. And high use teenagers who spend 4 or more hours a day on social media were like 50 to 60% likely to believe like conspiracy theories, like the dangers of vaccines, anti-Semitic propaganda and conspiracy theories, incel conspiracy theories as well, deep state conspiracy theories, like 67%, like high numbers compared to the adult respondents of the survey. So I found that was interesting, but I do think it's a concern across the board.
Thank you guys so much.
Hi, my name's Matt. I had a similar question about the disinformation and also influence of family or parents. Up until that last answer, I don't think we heard anything about what changes at 18 that would suddenly make someone less susceptible to misinformation or less susceptible to their family influences. We know that even as adults, people often are influenced by how they grew up, how their family voted, how the people around them, their colleagues at work voted, how their boss wants them to vote. I don't see anything changing except for the fact that students who are in that 16 to 18 group, almost all of them are receiving factual education in history and factual education in civics at school, where most of the adult population is not receiving that factual education on an ongoing basis. So I was wondering how you would address that point.
So I think there's a big difference at 18 in that most 18-year-olds are no longer living in the same household as their parents, that they're gone in the military, they may have gone out to work on their own and living on their own, or they may have gone on to higher education. And wherever they are, they're being exposed to different ideas, different perspectives, and they're starting to think through what is their own political theory, their own political ethos, what issues do they care about, how did they relate to their government. Certainly, this was a big issue for lowering the voting age to 18, which happened during my lifetime. It was because of people serving their country and dying for their country. But I don't see anything at age 16 that would justify that level of involvement. There's nothing else other than the beginning of driving a car, but there's not taxes paid by 16-year-olds typically. There's not, 16-year-olds don't typically own real estate or start a business. So I think 18 is the number that we've chosen as a society for a big change in people's lives.
Hello, my name is Gordon. I'm from Suffolk. My question is on the local question about taxes. Like going back to what you said, Representative, like I don't even think young people know what local governments are mainly responsible for. It's the budget, and let's be so for real. Young people probably don't even look at the budget, but anyways, that's not my point. Going back to like 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds, they don't usually own property. So why should someone vote in an election when they don't own property, don't pay property taxes, they're under their parents are paying the taxes. So it doesn't really make sense. My second question is populism. In my town, we're facing a deficit, especially with the teachers union, and all the students love supporting the teachers. They want to raise the salaries, but we can't pay for their salaries. So how does populism impact 16-year-olds and 14-year-olds if the solution isn't realistic? So I have two questions, the tax and the populism.
Well, I think that, I know people that are in their 20s, people that are in their 30s that still get money from their parents and that still don't own property. So I always think that like when we talk about property, it always goes back to the founding of our country, kind of a perfect spot to be in to talk about that, where it was only rich white men that could vote. who own property. So there's always that kind of concern of when we talk about property ownership going back to unintentional disenfranchisement. I think that when we talk about 16 and 17-year-olds, there isn't really, because property I don't think is necessarily tied to voting anymore. I don't think that's as much of a barrier as it may have been, even 50 years ago, but especially at the founding of the country. But I do think populism is a really big issue when we talk about this. I think it goes beyond 17 and 16-year-olds voting. I think that like my uncle is in his 50s, 60s, he's gonna watch this and he's gonna be mad at me that I'm talking about it, but he doesn't know much based off what he's seeing on the news because of that populist message. And I think that 16-year-olds, it goes back to civic education, disinformation and misinformation. It's all tied together, and I think that it is harmful, and I think that that needs to be the kind of thing that, for example, in Somerville, we were going to lower the voting age. We filed a home rule petition that, if it had passed, would have been, combined with a big civic education push. And we already have pretty decent civic education, but it would have been, really solidified in the curriculum. So I think that adding things like populism and the background of it and why is so significant and important, and the need to be careful about how that all balances everything, should be taught in schools as well.
Hi, thanks for having the debate about voting age, and for bringing in this point about misinformation. I think an important piece here is the framing of the question. So right now we have an age-exclusive qualification for voters, and I think the opposite of that is not a different age exclusion for voters, but rather designing our election systems for age inclusion. So I wonder, which questions might have been asked instead, and which other truths might we have been able to cover had we been looking more comprehensively, and not just 16 and 17-year-olds, but childhood as a class of people. So I guess I might ask any member of the panel to respond to the sort of universal suffrage call that's rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 21, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the United States ratified in 1992 and requires domestic enacting legislation.
Trey?
No, I appreciate you coming before us and sharing that. It's I had noticed you were giving me a thumbs down when I had said, well, where are we going to go next? 16, 14, and I can understand where you're coming from. I think you're completely right. There's a shift in mindset, right? This conversation was definitely, we are excluding a certain group from voting, whereas you're trying to have a more inclusive approach to this subject matter. So I'm curious to learn more, and I definitely will check this out. So I appreciate you coming before us. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, my name is Heitor Chavez. I'm a second-year student at Northeastern University. I guess my question is more for the pro side. I was wondering, if we do lower the voting age for 16, what prevents us from lowering even more in the future? What specific criteria should we determine for the voting age? Why not 15, for example, or 14? Kind of building up on the last question a little bit. So yeah, what specific criteria should we use to determine a minimum voting age?
I think 16, at least for me, and I think in terms of like the rhetoric that exists and the conversations that exist, falls kind of in first like a period of like life, like high school life, where things are stable, like we mentioned earlier, but also where there's academia and research to suggest that people generally, like teenagers at 16, have a generally formed kind of framework for making rational long-term decisions. And so it's not as much as like 14, where they might just be getting introduced into a new context, into a new setting, and not have the infrastructure or like the skill set needed for it. And then it's like not, even younger than that, because as a society, I think we've kind of accepted that there are age thresholds for X, Y, and Z things. I know like to be a US rep, you have to be 25. To be a senator, to be a US senator, you have to be 30. To run for president or be president, you have to be 35. And those are ages that are set like semi-arbitrarily, but based off of, I think, what have been acknowledged as kind of stages in life. And I think what we're thinking about, I don't want to speak for everyone, but what we're thinking about is kind of the stage in life that 16-year-olds are at in like a general, kind of generalized context.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
set. Okay, that concludes our program. I just want to thank you all for joining us, the audience and the panelists, and to our hosts, Nat Chidley and the Revolutionary Spaces team, GBH News, the Forum Network, Suffolk University, and its Congress to Classroom program. Professor Rachel Cobb, who this wouldn't have been possible without you, Professor. And thank you to our debate participants, Hannah, Representative Custer, Trey, Kunal, and Patrick. And a final thank you to our audience.